folks, this is Tim Freitas with the Garden of English. Today we're going to take a quick peek at how to use a thesis template to create a really good thesis for a rhetorical analysis essay. When I do so, though, I'm not going to exemplify my typical command and conquer method where we use the prompt to create a conquer question and whatnot. Instead, I'm going to actually just use my definition of purpose in order to say if we have kids reading for purpose and annotating well, like I've looked at in the last few videos, we should be able to put all of that together into a really strong thesis statement. So just so you all know, when I start teaching rhetoric to my sophomores, the kids always read for purpose first, and then after they know how to read for purpose consistently, I'll start introducing rhetorical annotations, and then we'll combine that all into what you will see in the template later on in this video. Today's text that we're going to use is going to be George W. Bush's post 9/11 speech, so I'm going to just pull that up right here. And so this is it. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is that before I have the kids annotate, like I had mentioned previously, I'm going to have them read it once through with me and try to identify the purpose of the piece. Now, my definition for purpose is not necessarily everybody else's, and that's okay. But you need to know how I teach it to my kids so that you can understand where I'm coming from with this particular thesis template. So purpose for me is what the audience is supposed to both understand and do once they've experienced the discourse. And sometimes people like to argue with that definition, and they're like, no, a purpose can be to inform or just to explain or just to aesthetically please, which is fine. But I think that even if I'm informed of something, I'm still supposed to at least reconsider how I've thought about whatever I was informed about before. Anyway, I am going to annotate this just a little bit so you can see how I would have kids annotate as they read. I'm assuming that this would be the second time we've read through after I've taught annotations, after we've talked about purpose. I'm not going to read the whole speech. Most people are familiar with the George W. Bush post 9/11 speech anyway, but I am going to look at just some of the first parts so you can see what I would do or what I would expect for my kids to do, and then we're going to try to put it all together. So anyway, nonetheless, here we go. We are going to start right up here at the beginning of the speech, and it says, "Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts." Now, for annotation purposes, I would have my kids draw a little mark right after "good evening," and then an arrow to this side, and write EX, which stands for exordium. If they wanted to, because they didn't want to mix it up with exemplification, if they wanted to write web, that's fine too. But that's how George W. Bush... Oh, I'm in the way on that one. Let's see if I can move over here for a couple minutes. That's how George W. Bush is actually engaging the audience with that kind of just respectful, hey, good evening. Ironically enough, it was a pretty terrible evening if you remember that, which I think that most of us will. Anyway, it says, "Today our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts." And when I look at these language like deliberate, hold on, let me get my pen working here again, right? When I see things like deliberate and I see deadly and their terrorist acts, sure enough, I'm going to write description here because he is describing the intention of those attacks. As we continue, he says, "The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors." I'm going to have my kids actually label this as definition because he defines who the victims themselves are. And because of that, we know as rhetoricians that this is really trying to showcase how everybody's been affected on a national level. On top of that, though, this then shifts from the exordium to the background. So this is some good background information. It gives us the context for why he's making the speech in and of itself. As we continue, thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. So we see elements of definition because he defines their acts as being evil and despicable. And as we continue, he's going to move back to descriptions of these events. So we see the pictures of airplanes flying into buildings and fires burning, huge structures collapsing have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and quiet, unyielding anger. Now, this is where we start to see a shift to the partition here. So I'm going to mark this because once he mentions the unyielding anger, most of us are in disbelief. Most of us are sad. Most of us are, in some sense in awe, and so we're quiet. But the anger, not everybody was angry. We were hurt, we were surprised, but anger typically promotes retaliation, and we're going to see that that's actually where he's headed with the majority of the speech. So, nonetheless, he goes on to say these acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but they have failed. So this right here is our key part. But they have failed. It says our country is strong and a great people has been moved to defend a great nation. And now we start talking about defending a great nation. So this whole part here is going to make up his partition that he will then support throughout the rest of the speech. On top of that, we see some cause and effect listed right here. So what was the cause, and then what was the effect? And it wasn't the intended effect as well. So that is something that we should highlight with our kids. So we see a little bit of cause and effect. Okay, the cause was this terrible tragedy, but the effect was that we've been moved to defend a great nation. So nonetheless, as the kids go through this whole piece, I'll teach them to annotate down the sides like that, and you can easily correlate the rest of the speech with confirmation and how he supports this idea that people are upset and angry, but they are indeed moving to defend a great nation. And you can also get to the end and really look at the so what part of it. And so that's really rich for rhetorical analysis. And we could talk about how he describes the tragic events from earlier that day. We could say he describes the vicious events from earlier that day. We could say he defines the victims. He personally defines the victims. There are many different ways that we can label his rhetorical strategies here, and we want to show that to kids as we annotate throughout. Now, what I'm going to do next is this. I want to just think about, when you go through this, if you were to ask your students, what should they understand if they're this audience in the United States, and then what should they do? Sure enough, what's going to happen is they're going to probably try to say, well, people should be understanding that the nation is upset. Okay, we want to say, yes, that's true. The kids will also typically say that the nation is still strong, though. Great, that's true, too. And then I always ask kids, okay, what else does it seem like he's trying to get us to do, though? And I always go back to that part of the partition where he says, defend a great nation. And the reason why is because throughout the entire piece, it's implied that we should be angry and then desire to retaliate. And I want kids to get there, because now we have an understand, which is to be upset and collectively mourn, but not lose hope in the country. And then when I get there, I'm upset and I'm collectively mourning, but there's hope in the country because it's strong. It's also strong enough to provide justice, and therefore I'm going to support that quest for justice. Now, at this time, I'll also tell the kids a little bit about the political background and how the political world was similar to now, remarkably politically divided. And I'll ask the kids, well, what does he need? What does George W. Bush need in order to get that support to kind of retaliate? And truthfully, it's unity. So what we'll do is we'll think about all of those things that the audience is supposed to understand if we're talking about the American public, and we'll say, great, what should we then do now that we know that we can collectively mourn, but the country is strong? We should, come together, though we're politically divided, and support retaliatory causes. And it's not hard to get kids there. A nice little side lesson to do, though, is there are times when he does bring in a new audience, and that would be the terrorists and those who harbor them. And I ask them, well, what are they supposed to understand from this? And then what are they supposed to do in response as well? And you can get a different rhetorical analysis out of that, but we're using the same piece. But that's besides the point. Anyway, I brought up this little template here while I was talking about that, because this right here is my general template for rhetorical analysis. Now, this is only a template, so sometimes things need to be shifted around. But sure enough, I think that you're going to see that it fits rather nicely. And like I said, teach kids that they need to shift things around. But it encompasses all of what we need from the rhetorical situation. It has rhetorical choices. Here they're labeled as strategies, but if you want to call that a rhetorical choice, that's fine. And then it talks about purpose as well. So the template parts are this, though. In the genre, title, comma, and I typically have kids put in contextual information about the author and or the text as a non-essential, because a non-essential is, a core writing technique that's considered sophisticated, and it's typically adverbial, so we can get a little grammar lesson in there. And then I have author's name, does this, and does this. So we've got our choices there that will guide. And I have the kids move chronologically. Sometimes people disagree with that, but that's what I typically do. You'll see in my example that I don't actually do chronological elements. I do, I group my rhetorical choices, but I typically encourage my kids to write chronologically. Anyway, rhetorical strategy 1, rhetorical strategy 2, rhetorical strategy 3, or if you want to change that to choice just to keep with the language, that's fine. Then we have in order to, and then it says answer to the conquer, and I'm going to actually switch this right to where it says understand. I'm going to just put answer to understand. And then we have ultimately moving, insert the audience, and then answer to, okay, the do. Okay? And the reason why here is because what's going to happen is if the kids have found out this information, they've already written this idea of what the purpose is, and then they just have to go and find choices. They can just fill this in. So here's an example of one that has been filled in. So it says, in his post 9/11 speech, an address that recounts the state of the nation after deadly terrorist attacks, former President George W. Bush varies his pronoun usage. Notice I did not actually use the word use. I turned use into a rhetorical device of pronoun usage. But anyway, George W. Bush varies his pronoun usage, subtly shifts his tone, and repeats patriotic metaphors in order to highlight that although all are experiencing tragic grief, the country is and will remain strong, ultimately moving the divided American public to unite and prepare for retaliatory action. Now, this is great because it highlights what the kids have to do. They have to talk. They start with talking about pronoun usage. They then move to subtle shifts in tone, and then repeating patriotic metaphors. That's going to help them as they organize their paper. I've got body paragraph 1, 2, and 3 right here, and each time they need to say, okay, does this varied pronoun usage relate to them experiencing grief? Does it relate to the country being strong? Maybe a little bit of both. Okay. And then does the varying pronoun usage actually help them unite? Does it help prepare them for retaliatory action? So the effect of these strategies or choices are actually found in this understanding of purpose, and this outlines that for them. There are other ways that you can word this, though. When my kids typically go through this and they write chronologically, my kids typically start with, he defines the parameters of the victims. He moves on to establish himself as a leader. He moves on to embrace first-person pronouns, and that's meant to establish him as a leader. And then as we scroll down, they typically like to jump on this Psalm 23 at the end, and they say he creates a false crusade. This idea that he's quoting from the Bible when the terrorists are known to be from Islamic countries. And so because of that, it kind of sets up another us versus them. So my kids will pick one from each section of the text, beginning, middle, and end. They'll add it to the purpose, and then they'll put it in a template just like this and create their thesis. And the kids could be writing about different things in different parts of the text. One might have at the very beginning, like I said, defines the parameters of the victims. Okay. The next one, another student might, instead of saying repeats patriotic metaphors, a kid might say repeatedly compares the country to other patriotic elements here, right? A lot of times kids focus on the steel industry being the core of the U.S. economy when it first, really erupted. And I'm like, that's fine. We can talk about those things. So nonetheless, here's a little template. Here's what the outcome looks like. You'll see a full rhetorical situation. We've got the audience. We've got the speaker. A lot of times with this non-essential, we have some of the background there. We have the choices, and we have the purpose. So all of it's here, and it's going to guide a really strong paper. Now, as one little added bonus, I have another example right here. This is for the 1962 JFK press release about the steel industry. where it goes through the same exact movements here, so that you can see how this works when you have to shift things around a little bit with the template. So this one reads, throughout the 1962 press release, in response to the steel crisis, John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, presents public sacrifice, lists dire consequences, alludes to Cold War tensions, and reveals voluminous profits in order to vilify the actions of the steel executives, ultimately moving the American public to join the cause in demanding lower prices and greater public responsibility. I know very few people who would get thesis statements like this and not look forward to reading the essay. When I'm a reader at the AP exam, if I get thesis statements that look anything like this, I am grateful that I'm not reading a classic. Uses many rhetorical devices to achieve his purpose or her purpose, or uses ethos, pathos, and logos to achieve his or her purpose. So the template is here. I will actually put this document down below if you want that. So please note that. Other than that, that's today's video. If you have any questions about how to enact this, by all means, just leave it in the comments down below. By the way, we're super close to getting 200 subscribers. Once we hit there, I'll look at all the people who have commented on past videos, and you have a chance to win a Garden of English t-shirt, which there's also a link to those down below. On top of that, there are some new designs, and I happen to be a huge fan of the Flamingo piece by Jennifer Price. And I have asked a current student of mine to create a flamingo design for the Garden of English. She did so we have those on shirts now too. But we will we will do a giveaway with one of those shirts once we hit 200 subscribers, and we are very, very close. So leave a comment, subscribe, and then check out a shirt if you want to. And we'll be back probably in about a week or two. And at that point, I'll look at this post 9/11 speech, and we'll talk about body paragraphing, and I'll give you a template for that as well. Until then.